Jewish Insights with Justin Pines on JBS is made possible in part by the clubs at Pearl River, New York, luxury rental communities for ages 55 and better, now leasing Phase 3 at the Reserve, and the B.L. Manger Foundation.
הנה מה טוב ומה נעים שבשחים גם יוחד הנה מה טוב ומה נעים שבשחים גם יוחד הנה מה טוב ומה נעים שבשחים גם יוחד הנה מה טוב
Shalom and welcome to a special episode of Jewish Insights. When I was studying in Israel back in 2005, I was studying with a gentleman named Rabbi Michael Hatton and had the opportunity to learn what's called the early prophets. The early prophets part of the Bible is the story of Joshua, the story of the Judges, the story of Samuel 1 and 2 and Kings 1 and 2. And the thing that stood out, it was my favorite class there. I was literally obsessed. And I was like, the story of David is the most amazing story. How have we not seen this in Hollywood? This needs to be told. The story needs to be told. And it is one thing to dream and to talk about it. And I remember even sitting with a friend and saying, obviously it has to be a musical, those types of questions. But it's one thing to imagine those things. It's another thing to, really spend, as you'll see in the next hour, 3 decades making that dream come to a reality. The movie David, out right now, is certainly the most significant animated biblical film since Prince of Egypt. It is a must-see. I am so enthusiastic about it. Any person I've seen, I've told you have to go, you have to bring your family. It just, from beginning to end, it is beautifully animated. It's so heartfelt, it's so inspiring, and it's so entertaining all at the same time.
When the sheep scatter, a shepherd is who they need.
That'll teach you to mess with my sheep!
Are you going to sing or what?
Follow the light!
Get out! The king's love of the crown has consumed him. David, are you ready to be the next king?
What? No.
No?
Don't mess this up for me, David. I get to be a princess.
I'm just a shepherd. We already have a king.
We will crush your kingdom!
Those are fighting words! Bring out Goliath!
This ride I've always followed when I'm looking for the way.
He's huge.
Searching for the answer in the moments I'm afraid.
Yep, we're dead.
If you want the secret of freedom and feeling alive.
I told you.
He's brave. He is true. No.
He's so humble, too.
Come on and follow the light.
David! You have stolen the hearts of my people!
I have never wanted the throne.
Lies!
What happens now? You stolen David. Fight to the death.
I never asked for this.
The true battle is not against flesh and blood, but in our hearts.
I'm a shepherd. What can I do but look after my sheep?
Come on and follow the light.
I think the most recent numbers is that over 75 million people have seen it in the US alone in theaters, and global, I'm sure it's even larger. And today I'm overly whelmed and excited to welcome our guest, who's the visionary director behind this long labor of love, joining us from South Africa, who's Phil Cunningham. And just before we begin, I just want to thank our mutual friend, Dan Luxembourg, for connecting us to have this interview. So here we go. Phil, thank you so much. Really, I was saying it before we went on air. I just first want to just say thank you on behalf of the world for making this contribution. I see some of the beautiful animation behind you of the film. You really contributed something so special to the world. And I want to start by asking you to typically I ask a guest to introduce themselves and tell the story of how they got there. But I'm going to try to use mutual language here, which is first to just define what is a testimony, and then to share what is your testimony that brought you to this moment.
Oh, thank you. And another word I would use maybe is my story. Like, how did I get to this moment? And thanks for that question. It started over 30 years ago for me, canoeing down a beautiful river in Africa called the Zambezi River. You could canoe for 4 days, 5 nights. You wouldn't see a human being. And for me personally, I always loved storytelling. So as a little boy, I'd always draw cartoons in my books. But out in the wild there and on the Zambezi River, that's where I personally fell in love with God. When I looked up at the galaxies, the stars, the thunderstorms, it was just astounding to me. And at the same time, I was reading David's story. And, there's a thing that says, I found in David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. And I was like, wow, David is an incredible person, obviously, in human history. Whichever angle you come at David from, whether a faith background or not a faith background, he's just one of the most incredible humans in history. And of course, he's flawed like all of us. He's not perfect, but that just makes him more relatable. But what struck me the most was that description that he's got a heart after God's own heart. And I was like, David was fun. He was adventurous. He was musical. And so I started reading deeply about David, and his story just inspired me so much. And that's where the idea started. I actually wasn't in the film industry at that stage, but I was like, wouldn't it be awesome if we could tell a story, make a movie about David's life, just how it might give people a glimpse of God's heart, this expansive heart that created 2 trillion galaxies that we know of, at least.
Beautiful.
Anyway.
So I want to pull out a couple of things that I heard you say. One was you had your moment where you felt you connected to God, and you felt like, okay, this is something which I completely relate to. For me, that was around, I was around 13 when that happened for me, around my bar mitzvah time. And that really changed my life forever. And the second piece I hear you saying is at the same time, you were getting kind of more and more interested in David and feeling like that was a unique character that represented that. I love the language of man after my own heart, and I want to break that down. And then the third, I hear you saying that it wasn't like you were someone who was a veteran of the film industry and on a vacation happened to be reading about David, and we should do a movie about this one too. This became kind of your labor of love. So let's I want to go through those a little bit. Let's start with David. Just tell me, and then we'll talk about the film industry piece. Tell me, when you said you kept reading up on David, were you you were bringing a Bible with you and you were reading verses of it, or you were reading books about David? How did you get into David, and what were you discovering before we even get to the movie?
So I'd say the first point of entry was 1 and 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings, and 1 and 2 Chronicles, and the Psalms, because as we know, David wrote half the Psalms that are recorded in the Old Testament. And that gives you such a glimpse of his heart, because reading the history about somebody is amazing and interesting and tells you about the exploits and the courage and all that. But reading the Psalms gives you another dimension. So I think if you look at the whole of Scripture, the Old Testament, there's so much information on David, both historically, but also you can get into his heart and his soul, because as you read the Psalms, you can see into what he was feeling, what he was thinking. And I think that's just beautiful. So I read the Psalms, and I read 1 and 2 Samuel and 1 and 2 Kings and Chronicles as well. Yeah. And then obviously I started reading books around that. So I got hungry for his story. I started reading other literature around that. Yeah.
Right. And I remember also, I think I had got 3. Robert Alter has a book on David. I had 2 others on David at the time that I just was reading anything I could get my hands on. So I could totally relate. Yeah. Talk to me about, as I said, how does one who's not in the film industry, what industry were you in? And how do you decide I'm going to make a film that's going to rival what's going on in Hollywood in the box office one day? How does that happen? And how do you have that thought? And how do you pursue that?
Such an interesting question. Actually, at that moment, I was still at university and I was studying agriculture at that time. When I was canoeing down that river and had this thought, and I loved storytelling, but obviously filmmaking seemed a million miles away. But what did strike me when I was at university was the incredible impact Hollywood had on the world, for good or bad, not all good, but a mixture of just how society, themes of courage and perseverance, and then some other not so wholesome themes. But what did strike me was the incredible impact movies have on the world and the way people think, how it shapes society's heart and mind. And I was like, wow, I'd love to get into the movie industry. But I was in Africa, I was in agriculture. I met my wife at university, and you'll see why this is important in a moment. But the most incredible person. And we set out on our journey and we started an agricultural business, which was going really well. But she could hear my passion for movies. And she was like, Phil, I really think you should get into the movie industry. And I said, well, it seems impossible. But she was reading a saying about it, that an eagle that chases 2 rabbits, both will get away. And she's like, if you want to do this, I think you've got to shut down our agricultural business we've got to go for the movie business. It's a bit like that Spanish invader Cortez when he arrived. Not that everything he did was great, but the principle of what I'm about to say is maybe interesting. He'd make his men burn the ships, and so they couldn't go back. There was only one way forward. And Jackie, my wife, said to me, if you want to make movies, we've got to burn the ships, close down agricultural business, and we've got to go for this movie business. And I'll promise you the first 10 years were so difficult, so hard. I was like, what have we done? But we had burnt the ships. There was no going back at that point. Yeah.
Wow. And just tell me practically, how does one do that, right? You're chicken farming, if I remember, right? That's what I read to you. And all of a sudden you decide, okay, here I am in South Africa. I'm going to try to make a movie. Like, do you move to LA and become a PA on a production set? That's not what happened here. So what did you do? What was that journey?
So interesting enough, at that stage, we were still in a little country called Zimbabwe, which is above Cape Town and above South Africa. So we decided if we're going to get into the movie business, we need to move and we need to go to Cape Town. There's at least a resemblance of a movie industry that was starting in Cape Town, where there was just literally zero happening up in Zimbabwe. We had 3 little children. So we packed our bags and we got on we closed down agricultural business. We took the investment we did have and we moved to Cape Town with about 8 families. And it was so interesting. On the way, we put all our belongings in a train in the containers. When we arrived in Cape Town, the train had been robbed, and actually all our furniture, all our computers, all our equipment was gone. So, and we had 8 families with young children all looking at me saying, what have you done? So that was the start of the journey. But the way we did it was, I took money we'd made in the agricultural business and we made our first movie, which was a stop frame animation called The Legend of the Sky Kingdom, which took street art in Africa. Like, in the street art is beautiful, piece of copper, rubbish, wire. They made these beautiful characters, and we made a stop frame animation movie just to get into the business. But already in my mind was David. I was like, but we'll get to David later. We've got to crawl, walk, run our way to David. But that's how we kind of started. We took all our money that we'd made in the agricultural business, we put it into this project and a little project called Jungle Beat, and then that's how we started. And we had no experience, and we wrote one script straight into production, and that was kind of like our film school of what not to do.
Amazing. Okay. And did you, I'll ask in 2 directions here. I've heard you kind of, use the phrase arc to triumph about this, did you know from the beginning, like, was it, you mentioned you want to walk, then crawl. Was it kind of like, I want to do all this practicing because one day my masterpiece is going to be the David? Is that how you were thinking about it?
100%, because I felt like David's story is the cornerstone to billions of people about, their faith or just their life. And I was like, we can't go to this movie fast. We need to get there. And quickly, to talk about what you just said, the Arc de Triomphe. Jackie, my wife, and I were walking through Paris, and we stood under the Arc de Triomphe. And we're, as creators and as filmmakers, we were just looking up at the scale of the Arc de Triomphe, the attention to detail. And in Paris, you've got obviously lots of factory buildings and office blocks. And we were like, as filmmakers, we can just churn money and make it a business, or we can aim to make an Arc de Triomphe. And that's what David was always in my mind. Before we got there 30 years ago, it had to be an Arc de Triomphe in the sense of scale and attention to detail, and hopefully a beacon of inspiration to our generation. So we definitely intentionally crawl, walk, run towards David. Mm-hmm. And I'll say one other quick thing. Sorry, I hope I'm not talking too much, but I'll quickly say. I was reading Michael Dell's biography where he says, always employ people smarter than yourself. So on that journey of crawl, walk, run, we always were trying to build the team. And when we finally got to David, and we can talk about this a bit more later, Justin, if you'd like, but we had the most incredible team of like over 400 people in 32 countries. And like our head of story was 20 years at Pixar. He was head of story at Pixar. He worked on Finding Nemo, on WALL-E, and he was here working on David. And then our director of photography was 20 years at DreamWorks, worked on projects like How to Train Your Dragon. And these are just a few examples. It was just this incredible magnetic pull towards the story of David, of people from all walks of life. It was incredible that this team slowly built and accumulated. But yes, a long-winded way to say your question, we were building our way towards David, and we only moved towards David 10 years ago in 2015 when we felt, okay, we feel like we've built enough skill and momentum to take this plunge now and go for it. Yeah.
Beautiful. By the way, it feels like a perfect metaphor for the story of David itself, where David kind of has this moment in your film. I see that, the photo over your shoulder where David's
Yes.
anointed, but it's not, I was with my kids in the movie and they were like, so he's a king now? And I was like, no. Like, that's what's going to, like, he was, anointed king, but then there's this whole series of events that needs to unfold until that moment. And even the film itself doesn't go until he's, king. I'm not, minor spoiler alert, doesn't go as far as him being king of all of the Israelites. It really gets to the moment where he becomes king of Judah. You kind of telling that story of there's this moment of this vision, then you're going to patiently build, one chapter at a time until you get to the level where you have the team and the experience to actually make David. It almost dovetails beautifully with the story itself. Beautiful. I want to ask you, sorry, we're going to say.
No, I was going to say something. I was just going to cue off something you said there. Like David gets anointed, like in this picture behind me, but there's still a long journey ahead of him. And we took such comfort on the journey from stories in the Bible like Joseph and Moses. And I'll quickly say what I mean. So Joseph has this dream, and then he's off to slavery and off to prison. And Moses has this calling on his life, and he's off to the desert for 40 years before he comes and actually fulfills that calling. David has an anointing, and he's off to the wilderness for 7 years. And on the journey, they say you often end up making the movie, living the movie you're making. And as we went through wilderness and setbacks and failures on making this David movie, I really drew courage from stories of Joseph, Moses, and David, because I was like, these heroes of the faith, these heroes of the Bible, they had to go through this incredible wilderness, slavery, and desert experience, and finally got to their dream or their calling or their anointing. So those stories in the Old Testament as well really inspired us as we were making David. Yeah.
Beautiful. I have to imagine there were moments where you had, doubt, setback, some sort of level of intensity there. Is there anything specific that stands out when you look back where you were like, I didn't know how we were going to get through that, but we managed?
Oh, there were so many setbacks, to be honest. I was reading, I'll give you one, but I was reading Winston Churchill's one saying where he says, success is going from one failure to another without losing enthusiasm. And I think, but I'll say the key to keeping the enthusiasm, Jackie, my wife's got this beautiful African proverb that she loves that says, if you want to go fast, go alone. And if you want to go far, go together. And I think the thing that helped us keep that enthusiasm and was just the community around this project. When one day you're feeling like, I don't have the strength to carry on, I don't know how this is going to happen, because you're trying to make a movie that genuinely competes quality-wise with Disney and Pixar and DreamWorks. But then you've got this amazing community around. When you're tired, they're like, Phil, we can do this. We can get there. And so I think it's the community, the team that really, if you want to go far, go together. Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
I'll ask you, kind of implied there, but I want to ask when you had that moment. When I was studying in Israel for the year and learning the story of David, I was thinking Game of Thrones the whole time. I was thinking This is going to be like every chapter of the book of Samuel will be a different episode of a series, and this could go on and on and on. And it's just like so dramatic and intense, and the blood and the soap opera and all those things. And, at what point did you say, this needs to be an animated film? I'll call it for families, if that makes sense. What inspired you to go in that direction? When did you decide that? How did that play out?
That's such a great question. I think when I was sitting on the Zambezi going back in my mind, at that stage, David was a feature film like Gladiator or Braveheart or a series exactly like you just described, because then you can really get into the characters. As we journeyed, I love young people and also observed something with animation. It's got this incredible power to cross race, cultural, age, and gender barriers, just better than any other medium. If you look every year, there's maybe 2,000 live action films made, maybe 15 animated films, and you'll always see 3 animated films in the top 10. And I was like, I really want to inspire young people. Just take the continent I live in as an example. The average age of a human in Africa is 19 years old. And so the future leaders, the future heroes are the youth. And I was like, okay, actually it was my wife's idea, Jackie. She said, Phil, have you considered making this as an animation? And I remember we were on holiday and I was on the beach. I said, well, that's a crazy idea. Went for a long walk down the beach, came back, and one of our other producers, Rita, had phoned and said, Phil, at the same day, weirdly, I think you should think about this being an animation. And then it started to dawn on me, I feel like animation, if you take a movie like Lion King, people are still watching it, over 20 years later. And I was like, if we really want to make an arc to triumph of David, animation's a great idea. And I think there's a room for a Game of Thrones kind of approach, a big feature film approach. There's definitely a way to tell David's story there, 100%. But for us, we started to feel we want to make this iconic, timeless project that whether you're 4 years old or 94 years old, you can love it, you can enjoy it. Whether you're sitting in Asia or in Israel or in the USA, you can love it. Yeah, so that's why we eventually went for animation, yeah.
I love it. And I'm at a different stage in my life than 20 years ago when I was more into Game of Thrones. And for me, selfishly being able to go with my family was such a special experience. So it worked well. And that's really interesting to reflect on the way that, it's so universal in that way. All right. So let's talk about some of the religious and faith themes that come through the film. I think one of them, which I love, I'll say that you mentioned earlier already, first of all, the idea of a man after my own heart. Let's call it the language I would use is kind of the idea of aligning your heart with God. Feels like a big piece of it. I'll say the other two I mentioned, and then you can riff however you want. The other one that really stuck out to me was the idea of the tapestry, which came, from David's mother. And the third, which, maybe it's related to, aligning your heart with God's, but this idea of just like faith and trust in God, because David just seems to kind of like let God guide him more than trying to have his own ego in it. Riff for me, what when you think about the religious themes, what are the key themes? Why are they important to you? And how do you think they came through?
Yeah, I was just thinking about us as humans being made in God's image. And the one thing that really inspired me about David, just before David in Israel's history, you've got this very silent period. Then David comes along, he fights Goliath, he does amazing things. Then suddenly, if you look in scripture, you've got this long list of mighty men, like a guy who climbed into a pit with a lion on a snowy day. Another guy who took on 200 men, it's these incredibly expansive, adventurous, brave, inspiring characters suddenly stepped onto history, into the pages of history. But a lot of that was sparked by David. But what made me think is okay, so David is made in God's image. And so this tells me something about God, a God who made, humanly now we know there's 2 trillion galaxies. Our galaxy is 100,000 light years across. So I was like, this kind of personality, this kind of God is super inspiring. And if David's the kind of guy who stood up against the giant and said, no, I'll fight you, it tells me something about God's heart. And I was like, this is somebody I'm really interested in, Of course, the kindness and the compassion of God and the mercy and the grace. And you can see that in David's life. Obviously, he was flawed and made mistakes, but I also saw that kindness in his heart and that aspect of him, and the poet and the depth, which I also got a glimpse of God's heart there. This person who could really love and loved his people so much, he's an amazing leader. And I think, quickly riffing off that, there's an interesting thing in our movie, which I think is true to the story itself. You've got 2 very different styles of leadership. David's style, which is a shepherd style, a servant style. He's there for the sheep. He's got this heart for his people as well. And then Saul's side, which is a bit like the Ring of Power. As power got to Saul's head, he started to become paranoid and controlling, and lost the reason of leadership, And so I was thinking, that tells me something about God's kind of leadership. He's there to connect and to serve, not to dominate and rule like that. So for me, David's story just started to reveal so much of God's heart for me. And I really started to fall in love with God. I was like, wow, this is somebody I could really connect with and follow, And one other quick story. You read stories like David's. There's a story about 3 of his mighty men when he was in the desert. And he was thirsty. He said, only if I could get water from the well in Bethlehem. And they fight their way through a Philistine, because at that stage, the Philistines had taken over Bethlehem. And this is not in our movie, it's just in Samuel. They fight their way through the Philistine army, draw David water, bring it back to him. And he didn't demand it of them. He didn't ask them. And I was thinking, they must have loved David, because they went and did something for him that took extreme bravery, which he didn't ask. And I was like, okay, that's leadership. Somebody who inspires people to do that kind of thing for them. He must have laid down his life for them. They must have loved him. He must have done something for them in their lives that they were like, we love this guy. And I was thinking about that with God. I was like, that's the kind of God I want to be inspired by and follow. And I would go draw water for him without him even asking, So, David's heart there is what I love. And just the adventurous, inspiring side, but also the gentle, romantic side of God that you see in the Psalms, Yeah.
Beautiful. And it's interesting. I want to come back to what you were just saying. But one thing you just made me think of also is I know it's hard to do everything in the movie, but certainly the movie feels very David centric. And you shared your piece earlier about how it's so important. The team is everything. And I think that's also a complicated part to weave in also, because you can't really spend time on, the people in David's army and the role they played in those pieces. There's a little bit of that. There's some Jonathan stuff a little bit, but it's hard to do everything. But I think that's an important piece to pull out. I want to stay in the faith and religion area. I think one of the themes which I mentioned earlier, which is so interesting to me, is this sense that, if you think of Prince of Egypt, Pharaoh's the bad guy. Moses is the good guy. It's about trying to overthrow Pharaoh. But in the David story, it's this weird dynamic where David doesn't want to dethrone Saul, and David doesn't see, Saul as like an enemy or evil. It's Saul, it's been established that Saul made the mistake with the Amalekites, and he kind of is flawed, and his time has come to an end. It's time to move on. But it's this weird, like Joshua after Moses dies, and it's Joshua's turn. But David has this weird thing where he's in Saul's palace, and Saul is like angry at him at times, and he has to try to wade through that. And I think the climactic scene, which you guys did so beautifully in the film, is when Saul comes into the cave takes a break, but he's searching for David. And David has this moment where he kind of gets like, within a breath of Saul. And instead of doing anything to Saul, takes a piece of his garment to show him, look, by the way, I could have killed you here, but of course I'm not going to kill you. I don't want to kill you. This is what I want. I'm just listening to God. And I thought that was such a powerful, like, how do you think about that question? And like, what was it like for you to see that moment come to screen? Because it feels like a core piece of the movie for me.
Yeah, there's so many dimensions to that part of the movie. Like where David, there's a beautiful thing there about forgiveness and loving your enemies and doing good to those even who are trying to harm you. And that's God's heart, So that's an aspect of David we see there. And we know in real scripture that happened twice, actually, but we just chose the cave scene for the movie. The other thing it really tells me is David's incredible faith in God's timing. Because I think so often as human beings, we try to take shortcuts, we try to take over from God. And David had incredible faith in God's timing. We can even see that with Abraham. He's given a promise, and he tries to take a shortcut to that promise and take it into his own hands. When God had told him it's coming, it happens so often in human history where, and I've done it, of course, like you can see a shortcut. Esau and Jacob. Esau gives up his birthright because he wants to take a shortcut. He's got a short-term hunger he's trying to fill, and he takes and what's interesting about David is he didn't do what Esau did. He waited on God's timing. And I love what he says in scripture. Even if he dies of old age or in battle, I won't lift my hands against him, even though Saul's trying to kill him. And that taught me something in my own life. It's like, trust God. Don't take matters into your own hands. Trust his timing. And David's an amazing example of childlike faith in God's timing. So I love that part of it. And also it connects, I don't want to give a spoiler to the movie, but it was a theme. Just, when Saul grabbed Samuel's robe and he tore off a corner, and Samuel said to him, this day the kingdom has been torn from you and given to another, talking actually about David, obviously. And then in the cave, David cuts off Saul's robe, which I found so interesting that's in history. It's a symbol of like cutting off the robe, but he's not personally going to take it away from Saul. So there's so many things happening in that scene to unpack it, but I hope that gives you a little bit of a glimpse of what was going on in my mind.
And I love that phrase, faith in God's timing, that just like beautifully spoken there, Phil. It just really, really like, wow, faith in God's timing. We all need more faith in God's timing. And that weaves in, pardon my pun, to this other idea of the tapestry. You introduced David's mother into the story, which I want to hear a little about that. And then one of the themes, she talks about is this idea of, and I think we're not spoiling, people hopefully see the movie, but I think just this idea of seeing the tapestry in the world and like you're on one side versus the other. So say a little bit about, the choice to bring in David's mother and the theme of the tapestry.
Oh, thank you. It's interesting. We did find a psalm that says, I serve you as my mother did, one of David's psalms. He says that about his mother. So it struck me. I was like, wow, his mother obviously had an impact on his life. My mother also she's passed away now, but she had the most incredible impact on my life and so many young people. I can remember when my brothers and my sister were teenagers, she was like, Phil, by your age, David was fighting Goliath. Daniel was in the lion's den. These guys were young. You've got to get out there, have faith in God, take risks, have adventures. And it was just incredible to see her influence on our lives and our friends' lives. And so I was like, it'd be so cool. Often mothers are stereotyped as being just in a movie or in a story as being very protective. And of course, that's an aspect of being a mother. But I really love this movie champions mothers around the world. They have such an incredible role in society and in family and in culture and in just in the whole of life. And so I thought it'd be so cool to bring in David's mom. And so that's why using his mom, because she genuinely obviously had an impact on his life. And so interestingly, we know that Ruth was his great-grandmother. So interesting, the woman in his life, the impact they had, just to give a good nod to that. But then what I love about this tapestry thing, the one thing that I've seen so often, sitting on this side of eternity, I think so often for us as humans, we're like, how do we reconcile God with suffering? And I was walking with my kids down the beach here in Cape Town, and I picked up 1 grain of sand, and I said, just imagine if this 1 grain of sand represents 70 years and the rest of the beach is trillions of 70s. That's this life on this earth. And God is looking at the beach, and we so often get obsessed with the 1 grain of sand. He's working out a plan for the beach. And that's what led us to tapestry, because I think so often if you look at the back of a tapestry, it looks messy. It's colorful, but it's like doesn't make sense. But there's a faith that on the other side of the tapestry of eternity, God is the most beautiful artist, and he's weaving together this beautiful tapestry that one day we will see. And we'll be like, that's why he was weaving this thread of my life with somebody else's life. And so often from the back of the tapestry, from this side of eternity, it's a bit confusing, doesn't always make sense. And that's why I think we've got to live by faith, not by sight, But we do know that on the other side, God is weaving this. And I think that's what David's mother's trying to say to him. Don't always understand everything, often don't, but I have got faith that God is weaving a beautiful story together in human history. Yeah.
Beautiful. I'll take it to, I don't know if I'd call it a personal level, but can you reflect a minute, this was a 30-year journey. And, in the small bit of the tapestry we're now, does it feel like are you reflecting now, does it feel like this was the right time and why?
For the movie, you mean to come out?
For the movie to come out, right? It could have come out 25 years ago. It could come out 20 years from now. But God's timing decided this was the moment. And are you learning in this process as it's out something that feels like, wow, this was the right timing, and now I know why?
100%. It's amazing. So many long journeys along the way. The journey along the way. I was like, it's incredible that 30 years later, the movie comes out exactly at this moment in history, 2025. I just found it, incredible that it ended up coming out now. It's there's so many things happening in the world right now, just faith-wise, leadership-wise, and around Israel. And I was like, it cannot be a coincidence that this movie on David is coming out at this moment in history. And I'll say this, kind of trying to link it. If you look at, I'll get to my point, but if you look at the impact Mamma Mia had on tourism in Greece, or you look at the impact Braveheart had on Scottish tourism, or Lord of the Rings had on New Zealand tourism, and it's not about tourism, but my point is movies have an incredible impact on social consciousness and where the needle's moving. And I really feel that the David movie can hopefully bring unity to the world. It's like his story is so unifying, and that we've all got giants, we've all got challenges. But at this moment in history where so much is happening, and there's quite a crisis of leadership in many areas perhaps, and there's so many world events. We know what's happening with Israel as a country, for example. It really feels that this movie lands at this moment. And I don't know the full reason why it's right now, but I can feel that it's the right time. Yeah.
We can't see the whole tapestry yet. Exactly. So you mentioned this kind of in the first question I asked you, and I wanted to come back to, which is, how this film fits into larger, movie and let's call it media culture, which I think is such an important piece for me. I think, I think one of the things that hit me hardest during this is my kids are often watching, whatever is available on media these days. And I think some of those messages are just so far from the messages I'm aligned with in my home. It's siblings that hate each other and they're disrespectful to the parents, and the mom and dad are like, it's all about making fun of them on the show. And it's like, and I get there's probably some fantasy in every child to beat their sibling or overtake their parent or those kinds of things. But it feels like those are pulling at the strings of how do we, get you to lean into not great values. And this, film feels like wholesome and inspiring and really, to bring my children to a movie theater and say, look at this thing. I want you to be inspired by what you're watching in this way. Felt so powerful. How do you think about that question of the larger culture and what this movie does, and also what could or should be happening in larger culture in terms of the type of values we're bringing to our families?
Yeah, it's so great. There's a friend of mine who was very involved in politics, and he moved into the film industry, and I asked him, why did you move into the film industry, And he was saying, and he was high up in politics, and he said what he realized is politics is so far downstream. And of course, there's room for politics. We need politicians. But what he was saying is he realized that movies and music and art and culture are shaping societies, how they're thinking, how they're approaching life way upstream. And actually in our world where, it's a global community now, it feels if you really want to impact your generation, one of the most incredible ways to do it is through music or movies or art. It's so powerful. And for good or bad, I was reading a story the other day saying stories are like Trojan horses. They get under people's defense mechanism, and ideas that they might not have been open to, a story kind of can get under it, and this is for good or bad, and plant a seed in their hearts, And so as storytellers, I think we've got a very hugely responsible role in the world, because stories we're telling are going to plant seeds. Anyway, to go back to your question, I felt like David's story, okay, if you're not coming from a faith point of view, there's still some beautiful things there for you to latch onto, some wholesome values of courage and fun, and there's so many beautiful things, leadership, humility that you can latch onto. And if you're coming from a faith perspective, there's even another dimension you could perhaps get out of the story. Like, for example, when David kills Goliath, I'm talking about a faith aspect now. He thinks, okay, now the people get it. See how great God is. He helped us. But they know, no, David's great. He's awesome. He killed Goliath, And what I hope as kids watch this, they see what David did there. He's like, no, it's not about me. And he tries to point back towards God. It's actually, the story is about God. This is his story. We in history, it's God's story. So if you're approaching this movie from a faith point of view, there's so many beautiful dimensions and wholesome things to bring out of it. And if you're not coming from a faith point of view, that's also fine. David is just this very inspiring character who lived and modeled servant leadership and so many other beautiful things. So, I just felt like this movie, I really feel, can be an arc of triumph, can be a beacon of inspiration for kids. And amazing, Justin, we've had such amazing, if you call it testimonies early on, but stories, if I can just say that, or whatever you want to call it, of how this movie's touched people's lives. I was reading one story about a little boy, not from a faith angle at all. And after he watched the movie, he'd been struggling with fear. And his dad wrote and said, we didn't know how to help him. And after David's movie, he said he just completely changed and lost his fear and had courage again. So I'm like, that's awesome. What he got out of the movie was to have courage, to have faith, and to step out there. Yeah. So hopefully it just really inspires people. Yeah.
I love it. I have one more question on that, and then I have another question, which is, I saw you use the language of like people coming from a faith-based perspective or not. And I agree that this movie can inspire anyone regardless of their background. Do you believe, I know you had your experience on the river. Like, do you believe that, and how do you think about the ability of, let's call it content or creativity? You said music, movies, films, all those things, to actually like instill a faith-based perspective in people. Is it possible? Do you think it's one of those things people are kind of born with or not born with, or like it's just like embedded from childhood, or they get turned off or turned on? Or do you think it's possible to kind of bring people into a faith-based perspective who aren't already in a faith-based perspective?
Oh, 100%. I think my belief is that God made us in his image, which means we've got this beautiful thing called free will, which he won't mess with. But we've got this opportunity, and I think stories and testimonies can definitely inspire people to perhaps look at things differently. I mean, I was thinking when I was going down the Zambezi, what made me think was, if you take perhaps the most complicated clock in the world, I forget the name of it, it's in Copenhagen, but they have like tours around it. Imagine the tour guide saying, this clock just kind of randomly got together. Like there was an explosion and this clock arrived, When I was walking through nature, I was like, they're so obviously intelligent. Well, for me anyway, my perspective, they're so obviously intelligent design. If you look at the way the galaxies are moving, the tides, the sun, it's like, if this is a cosmic accident, you've got to have more faith to believe in that, I think, than to believe there's not intelligent design. So my quest was like, actually just who's behind this intelligent design? So all that to say, I think humans are looking up at the stars. There's actually a verse in the Bible which says, God has set eternity in the hearts of man. So I think all of us as humans realize we're part of a way bigger story. We realize we're part of an intelligent design. And I think stories can guide us and point us and sow ideas that could lead us towards faith and exploring who God might be. Yeah, so I do believe that I think stories, music can open our hearts, because it's not just a mind thing, it's a heart thing, and art can move our hearts,
Beautiful.
I don't know if that answers your question.
You mentioned music a couple times. The role of music is a huge part in the original David story and certainly in the film itself. Just tell me how you thought about music and, approaching this film. What did you want it to be? What were you going for? I know you drew from Psalms. Just share a little bit about that.
Oh, that's so beautiful. Yeah, I was saying to the team, like, if they could make an amazing movie called The Greatest Showman on P.D. Barnum's life, I was like, and he wasn't a musician, like, we've really got to try and nail this with David, because whatever your point of view on God is, no one can argue that David was one of the greatest musicians in human history. Like, he literally wrote half the Psalms in the Bible, and the book of Psalms is the most read book in the Bible. So a lot of people know David's Psalms, So anyway, so music's obviously key to his character, who he is, and authentically how he approached life. And so the music was absolutely key. And I do believe music can move people. So the song Tapestry you talked about has got Psalm 121 and Psalm 139 woven into it. And Psalm 121, I lift my eyes above the hills to where does my help come from? And then Psalm 139 about being woven together in his mother's womb. So those two psalms are in the song Tapestry, for example. The other song which is, I think, where he sings "Why God" is a psalm that David literally writes, like, "Why God have you forsaken me?" And what I love about that is, about David is like he's so great, because if he's fearful, he speaks out his fear. If he's got joy, he speaks out his joy. If he's got questions, he's like, "Why God?" And I think as humans, he really gives us permission to approach God. God is big enough to cope with our questions. He's big enough to cope with our fears. And what I love about David's psalms and stories, and that's what I think music could do, is like, wow, David really just poured out his heart to God. And actually, I can do that as well, But also it really helps you get to the soul of the story. And like, I love that song, Shalom, which he sings to, which is one of the top trending songs, interestingly enough, when they're looking at the music album. When he sings to Saul and really gives Saul peace, is that word Shalom. It's powerful. So, music, as we know, is so powerful. It moves our hearts, not our heads. And I think music in this movie is a critical part of its fabric, or its DNA. Yeah.
Beautiful. All right, I want to ask you a couple other things about the film itself. I think it's not so spoily, but hopefully people have seen it already, or they should see it. But I want to ask you the choice. The Amalekites are faceless. I don't know how you describe. They're almost wearing, like, you don't ever see their faces. There's like skulls and stuff like that over their faces. Tell me a little bit about that creative decision. When did you think of that, and like what were you going for there?
Okay, maybe I can take a step back to answer that question.
Please.
And I will get to it. So one of my huge passions in this movie was authenticity and accuracy. And we did 5 trips to Israel with the team. We engaged with, for example, an amazing rabbi in Jerusalem called Rabbi Tuli Wise. And every flower, like if you look at the Valley of Elah, we went there, that red and me is literally what you'll find. And we do know, it's interesting, we look at medieval, back in European art, they've got David and Goliath, but in this desert. But actually, we know that kings went to war in springtime. And if you go to the Valley of Elah in spring, you'll see these beautiful flowers along the Valley of Elah. All that to say, every aspect of this movie was deeply researched. I was saying to the team, they all came from different life perspectives. Let's take comic book fans. You can't take Superman's cape, put it on Spider-Man. You're going to upset your comic book fans. And I was saying, if you look at the biblical text we're drawing from, this is the cornerstone of many billions of people's faith. So we can't go just messing with things and what we think is, we wanted to make it entertaining, but not at the expense of authenticity. So literally every flower, even in the song Tapestry, you'll see it shows some of Israel's history, and it goes the direction that the Hebrew alphabet would be written, not the English alphabet, the way the pictures move. So the flowers in the valley, the kind of birds, you'll hear the hoopoe bird, the national bird of Israel. There's deep work gone into making sure it's rooted in authenticity geographically and biblically and archaeology, and on the archaeology side as well. So when it came to the Amalekites, so the Philistines we know were actually originally from Greece. And so you'll see at the back of Goliath's shield, you'll never see it in the movie, but they'd actually designed it like a ship, the ship ribbing of a ship. If you'd gone like that, you would have seen that. And on the front of his shield, you had the 5 cities of Philistia. All that to say, we did deep research into that. And the Amalekites, so it was interesting because you've got a movie, you've got a very short time for the audience to try and track what is happening. So it was quite important that you could track the difference between the Philistines, the Amalekites, and so David was battling 3 things, the Philistines, the Amalekite, and Saul, and actually fear internally as well. So the Amalekites, we want to try and distinguish them. We do know back in history that they used a lot of what they call like shape-shifting, and they used animal skulls and that kind of thing. So we wanted to try and make them an enemy that kind of was a nod towards history. And they're no longer a people anymore, the Amalekites, they no longer exist. But that's back then what they were. And so it was just to try and differentiate them from the Philistines as well, but stay true to research and history, if that makes sense. Yeah.
I was
but there's so much more to say on that. I mean, every frame of the movie, if you break it down, I love this thing Disney said, Justin. He said people won't always see the detail, but they'll feel the detail. And I'd say every frame of that movie has just got so much detail in it in terms of research. And there's not a frame that's not like done with love, if I can say that. Yeah.
And I mean, I'm not an expert, but from the little that I do know, it felt it. Like I remember noticing the flags of the individual tribes, yes, and also like very much in the background, but it was just there. And I was whispering to my kids, look, that's the flag, like that, those kinds of things. Saul's from Benjamin, like those kinds of little details, and pointing it out. And by the way, you mentioned the Psalms as well. There's references to all different Psalms that my children know, and just saying like, look, he's singing the Psalms that he's singing, I ask only one thing of God, to dwell in your home, or, even though I walk through God is my shepherd, those kinds of things are all in there. And I love the attention to detail. The Amalekites, I don't know, I was thinking more, and I guess this is why you have audience and you have the creators. I think I was like projecting a sense of like, if the Amalekites represent true evil, like true evil is like in some way faceless or something like that, that it's like, right, you mentioned like shape shifting, that it's some element of, it's not this one human that looks this way represents evil. It's something about what's you can't see all the time.
No, but you are right. We're trying to show the different kinds of, because like in the anointing scene where Samuel says to them, our battle's not against flesh and blood, but in our own hearts. Like he's trying to say our battle is actually in our own hearts. So they represent different things. Like the Philistines represent physical oppression. The Amalekites did in this movie represent more pure evil. And then Saul represents a different kind of challenge. So, and they're all different and just as difficult as each other, actually. But you are right. That was part of the thing. Going back to the music, the other thing is in the anointing, what the rabbi had said to us, if I remember, I think it's Psalm 118. So when Samuel is singing in Hebrew, it's Psalm 118, which we were told feels like that's what would have been sung over David as he was getting anointed for Psalm 118. Yeah.
Beautiful. That was an amazing scene. So, by the way, I want to talk about Samuel a bit. By the way, people asked me what I thought, those kinds of things. I said only glowing things. My one critique, I'll just share with you, and you'll tell me if it was on purpose or not, was I found like Samuel to be like a bit cranky. Like I didn't know, like and I saw in an interview, the gentleman who played Samuel mentioned that he was kind of like told this is not like sweet Broadway. You're meant to be a little bit more like scratchy. And like, I'm Joseph Samuel is my Hebrew name. So and both are people who were murdered in the Holocaust, but I take on their names both as the individuals, but also the biblical characters that I carry. And I very much look up to Samuel as well. And the Samuel character, I don't know if it was like more like he's late in his career. So he's a little bit, I felt like, I don't know if that was intentional or not, that he was meant to come off as a little bit like, I don't know if you call it short-tempered, a little bit like rough around the edges, I guess, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, it's interesting because when in animation you're trying to create, even just take shape language, you're typically trying to create quite a variety in shape language, particularly for the kids, to give them just so not everyone feels as generic. So Samuel, the idea was to make him interesting. When you got to push things a little bit in animation sometimes. I mean, maybe if I could go back and redo it, I did say to the team, as I felt like Samuel, where I would maybe change it slightly in futures, bring more, which I hoped would come through better, because in my heart it was like, he's also got this beautiful kindness. Like in the anointing scene where he talks to David's little sister, he's kind when he's talking to her. But because he represents God, and if he represents God's heart, you want that grace and kindness to also come through the prophet, So yeah, a little bit, if I could go back and redo it, I'd maybe just shape a little bit more of that softness and that kindness into him. Yeah, so you as a filmmaker, you always, I wish I could go back and just retweak this a little bit.
Of course, and I was curious if it was like an intentional thought, but it's like I understand the point around like you're trying to distinguish that. Also, I didn't notice this at all while I was watching, but I was reading online. There was a lot of talk around how like Saul and like a lot of the Israelites had like Middle Eastern or Israeli accents, but David had more of like a Western accent, if that makes sense. Did you notice that going through? Do you feel like that's a thing? Do you feel like that's like people just like creating nonsense to create nonsense? Like what are your thoughts on that?
That's so hard, because we wanted to approach the casting as authentically as possible. So we went through a massive casting process. And at first we were saying the people who, and this was true, we actually cast, young David was originally from Israel, and so was older David. But what we were finding is we were struggling to get the right performance out of them. So to carry the emotion. So we were like, sure, where do we come? So we, like, for example, David's mom lives in Israel. She's an amazing singer. She's well known in Israel, Miri Masika, actually. And she managed to land both the performance and the authenticity. In terms of trying to find David, we found two amazing actors, but it wasn't quite landing performance-wise. And we were like, this has got to carry globally. So we eventually went for performance. And the young David and adult David just were really amazing in their performance. What we sacrificed a little bit there, though, was authenticity. But filmmaking is always, it's a little bit about, you've got to make some trade-offs sometimes. So their performance was amazing. Maybe what you're losing a little bit is authenticity, which, it's hard.
Beautiful. And more from a space of curiosity. Tell me a little bit, certainly, I think one of the things the film does beautifully is a lot of people just know David and Goliath, and that's it. Yeah. But you did a film that was much broader than David and Goliath, but of course you still also had to do Goliath. And you mentioned, the Valley of Elah and how you guys did that beautifully. Just say a couple words about, how did Goliath come about? when you were putting the character of Goliath together, it's a giant, what's that going to look like? What's he going to look like? How's he going to behave? Just how did you think through the Goliath character?
No, that's so good. Firstly, I'll quickly say when we went to Valley of Elah, I thought it would be a massive tourist spot, which is not. It's a farm there. And I met the farmer there, and we had an archaeologist with us who showed us where there's a new site that's been dug called the City with Two Gates. So that we know that's where, because in the scripture it talks about the Israelites being there, and we know the two hills that the Philistines were camped on. So we knew the exact, actually it's pretty clear from what I can gather from our research, the line that David walked. So Brent Dawes and I, the other director, we walked the line. And it's interesting because the river comes in and oxbows away. And as we went down into the river, the acoustics of that river, it goes very quiet. And the sound of the doves went quiet. And I was like, well, and you'll see this in the movie actually. It gave us a moment, like when David goes down, he picks up that stones. It's a moment of quietness with just him and God, where the sound of the battle goes quiet. And then as he comes up over the ridge, you hear the sound of the battle come again. All that to say, getting to Israel and being geographically there really inspired that whole battle. When it came to Goliath, I was like, we were like, we really want him to be formidable because didn't want him just to be a brute force with no intelligence. Because the Bible describes him, he's been a fighting man since his youth. So I don't see him as just a brute who's just like huge and he's just a massive, dumb giant. He's been a fighting man since his youth. So we wanted to show him as intelligent. We also kind of pushed the extreme of his pale skin. He's almost like a Ferrari you park in your garage and you only bring him out when you're really going to go to town, So that's why you'll see he's got a very pale skin. He's not often called out, but when he is called out, he's like the Ferrari that they had in the garage that they pulled out for the battle. But we wanted him to surprise people, and that's why we had that little thing with this, where you think at first the armor bearer is Goliath. But that's maybe how people typically think of Goliath, and we wanted to surprise them with a Goliath who's actually intelligent and huge. Yeah.
Beautiful. I love that. One more piece I wanted to ask you. So certainly you went in the direction of a family film. One of the big things about David is David's flaws, David's mistakes, and not only, Bathsheba, but, I don't say that in English, but Bathsheba, but also, the things earlier and the bloody stuff and kind of that,
yes.
Was that a difficult artistic decision to try to think about, do we want to include some of, David's quote unquote challenge, mishaps, let's call them for lack of a better term. And, David was a bloody warrior and we want to go more in this direction. How do you think about that question?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's why I think the movie took 10 years to make, because we had so many iterations of the script. We had versions of the script where Michal, Jonathan's sister, was more in the story. And we had the Witch of Endor in there, which is in the story. We tried so many different routes, trying to keep it in mind it's a family film. And as we explored, we really iterated down that road and realized the implications of it. We tried to bring Jonathan in more, slightly different to what you're talking about, but to show the friendship more. But then whichever way we realized you've got so much real estate in a movie, you've got to pick your punches and choose a line. So I think what we were trying to show there, you can't do it all. You could actually in a TV series. That's where you could really unpack a lot of the dimensions you're talking about. We try to keep it as a family film. And so we had to pick our punches. What we tried to show with David was in the desert was his despair, and through that moment of why God, because ultimately it's a relationship between God and David is what the story is about. And so we try to show that human side of David when he's in that song where we can hear his anguish, where he's saying, why God, why? And then also showing his other failure where he tried to put on the Philistine army, take matters into his own hands, which we know is, when he did do that in history, it also just went from bad to worse, Mm-hmm. So those two moments, why God, and where he puts on the Philistine army and tries to resolve the situation himself, those are our two parts where we're really trying to show David's flaws. And then he comes back to his senses and actually turns back towards God again. But trying to put them in context of his relationship with God. Yeah. But it was tricky because you've only got a feature film. You're trying to connect with kids as well. So you had to make choices, but stay true to the Bible still. Yeah. Yeah.
And you did it beautifully. Really beautifully. Say, you mentioned a couple times the trips to Israel. Just say a little bit more, for you as a person of faith making this film, kind of, what stands out? You mentioned, walking through that valley and seeing the water. But what are some other things that stand out to you from that experience of visiting Israel and imagining the Bible there? And just talk me through that experience and what you remember from that.
Yeah, it might be just a personal thing, so not for everyone, but I think for us, we arrived thinking, we thought of Israel very two-dimensionally, when I'm talking about two-dimensionally geographically. It's like Israel's a desert and you're going to go there, and what we were so surprised about is the different biomes and how fast the geography changes. you drive one way out of Jerusalem and another way. And so just the interesting plants and animals and geography surprised us. We were like, wow, it's not just a desert. You know this, obviously, but getting there for the first time, we were delighted and surprised by the diversity geographically. It's also just incredible because, you've read these stories for 10, 20 years, and then to arrive and actually walk David's footsteps, to be in En-Gedi, where he was getting hunted by Saul, and actually feel the heat and see all the caves that he would have hidden in, it just brings it to life. You've read it on the pages, but I found En-Gedi is a good example where David was hiding out and running from Saul, and you could just feel how hot it was. But then there's all these caves, and so I think, and the Valley of Elah, and then going to Jerusalem, and it just helps you feel so much more. And I think there's also just being out at night. There's like a fabric to it you absorb that's beyond just visual. There's like a spiritual dimension to being there and just feeling where all these people would have walked and lived out their stories. So it's hard to describe how rich it was. And I'd say another huge part is the actual people we met there. It's just so interesting, the people we met. There was a tour guide who took us around the city of David, and hearing her story and how she saw David's mother and describing the city of David and Hezekiah's tunnel. And it's just so rich. And then when you come back now to rework the script, you've got another dimension now. You can feel it better. Yeah.
Beautiful. And it really came through so much in the film. I think of the other famous stories, right? There is Prince of Egypt, which mostly takes place in Egypt. There's the story of Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat, which it feels like could take place anywhere. And this feels like it felt, you really were kind of bringing the indigenous Israelites, their land and their people to life, right? You were saying I'm trying to imagine what's happening in the Bible when you read these stories, and you're bringing it to life in some ways.
Yeah, and Miri Masika was watching the one scene with us, and she started crying. I said, "Why are you crying?" We did some Young David shorts before the film, and she was watching one of the shorts, and she said, "I've been to that place. I think it's called Wadi Kalt, and that exact flower that you've got growing at that time is the exact flower, and only flowers for a short time period at that time of year." And she said, "The fact that you've taken the attention, if the water's running, that means that flower would be flowering, but it is the right flower." And so it was that was our passion, was to make it just really connect with what really is growing there. Yeah. And our researchers were so good. They went back. There were some trees that now exist that might be not indigenous, that were planted. So went back in history and said, in David's time, that tree would not have existed. So don't have that tree in the movie. It wouldn't have existed in David's time. And I think one of our artists had David eating chicken. He's there was not domesticated chicken in that time. So he gave them a menu and said, this is your food groups you can draw from if they're eating or they're talking. So there's things like that people might not notice, but every time you see someone even eating, it would have been what they would have been eating at that time in Israel. Yeah.
Amazing. The attention to detail is amazing. I want to, in our final few minutes, I want to focus on, all the work and this journey that brought us to the moment of the film being released, which was the end, December 23rd, I think it was, of 2025. Now we're several weeks in. It feels like it's been forever because I've made so many people watch this film already. Talk to me about the experience of shifting from making the movie into it being out there, and kind of what has that been like for you personally, and also what are new learnings you're having now that the film's, your baby has gone out into the world, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's such a good question. It's actually, to be honest, still trying to absorb it, because you've been working on something for 30 years, and so I'm still trying to digest that it's actually out there and in the world. What is encouraging, and I think it's actually faces us forward as well. Take a moment to just try and absorb it. But also watching and hearing, we're just getting such a flood of stories of people being inspired, of connecting. What I'm loving is hearing how some of the Jewish community getting connected with the Christian community, and just bridges being built as well. And I think what kind of inspires us is let's go do this again. So, take a moment to breathe, but let's get out there. And I think the next movie we really want to try and lean into is the story of Esther, because it would be so amazing to take a character like that, who was a female heroine, which would be just cool after David to maybe go down that road. And also that story is set up like a movie. Like David's story is more like a TV series, actually, because it's so long and so many characters, whereas her story is quite contained. It's it's a feature film waiting to happen. You've got the classic villain. You've got so anyway, it just also inspired us to start looking at what's next. What's the next movie? as you watch the response and as it goes into the world. Yeah.
Amazing. And Esther, you would do animated as well, I assume? Yeah.
Yeah.
Amazing. All right. I'm ready to see that for sure in a second. One of the things I want to reflect on both those. I want to just share a personal reflection, which really hit me in the face. I think, and I don't want to like create binaries or stereotypes, but I'm reflecting as a traditional Jew who's been in that space, and that like there's sometimes I think I'll speak for myself only. There was like, people ask me like, is it very Jesus heavy, to be frank? Like, is this the type of thing?
Yeah.
Like, I remember I once bought a book about the story of Jonah. It was a comic book, graphic book. It was amazingly done. And then all of a sudden there was a shift the last 2 pages where it was like ... and then it went straight. And so I had colleagues who were kind of like very, hesitant to bring their family to that space because they were worried about that. I don't want to comment on that. What I want to comment on is that it made me notice that like a fear of, the word Jesus or reference of Jesus as God appearing is something that like people might feel like as a Jew, they need to be worried about. And like, I felt like that fear compared to the, like being completely not sensitive to the fear of the values that are in non-faith content, to me feels like a totally misbalanced situation. It feels like there's so much opportunity for people of faith to align with each other. Yes, maybe, like the headline at the end is slightly different, but the value system, how we view family, how we view, God's timing, that language you used before, and how to have faith and those kinds of things, feels like there's so much opportunity to grow and learn from each other, and like a fear of like, well, religions can't mix, so let's keep that over there. But instead I'll have my kid watch something that is like completely devoid of all the values that I have in my home. Feels like a massive miss that like needs to be, I guess, straightened in some way, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And just to say on that, one of my passions, that's why I connected with Rabbi Tully, because I was saying to him, we want to respect the Jewish community and faith. And what we're trying to do is just tell a story about David. It's not got an agenda. It's David's story. It's an important story to the Jewish people. It's an important story to the Christian people, and in fact, the Muslim community as well, and the secular community. So we felt as filmmakers, our goal is not to preach to anyone, to persuade anyone of any, it's not my point of view. I'm just telling David's story, and you do with it what you want to do with it. But hopefully it's accurate in the feature film context, or it's authentic, So we don't want to try and change David's story. Our only agenda is to tell it well and excellently and faithfully, and then people can take out of it what they want, So I love what you're saying, and that's why I really wanted to engage Rabbi Tully, because I was like, I really want this to feel that the Jewish people can love it, that they can feel safe with this movie, and it's not some kind of, and also people of non-faith community, I want them just to realize we're just telling a story about a human being from history. He had faith. Whether you have faith or not doesn't matter. You can still watch the movie. He's going to inspire you. You don't have to have faith to watch the movie, and you can have a different faith. That's okay. But this movie hopefully will speak to you, whatever angle you're coming at it from. But I really hope that we made it in a way that honored, the story, the real story of David, without trying to tell people what we think about David's story.
Beautiful. And I don't know if this is your hand or the companies you worked with, but I also thought it was so cool. I never saw before that when first of all, you could bring a child for free. But then later, this idea that you could pay it forward and you could pay for someone else to go see the film. I've never seen that anywhere ever. My brother-in-law went to see the film and he told me he loved it so much he went online and bought tickets for other people to see it after him. Like, what a crazy mindset, especially you think about like capitalist culture, that you're saying this is a beautiful gift. Can you give it to someone else? Just say one word on that before we close.
Yeah, I think part of that was triggered when I was speaking to the Angel Studios guys. For me, I watched my first movie when I was 14 years old because I grew up in nature. We didn't have TV. We didn't go to the movies. When I saw that movie, I was so inspired. And so in my mind, I'm like, there's so many young kids, they'll never get to the movie house. But they've got giants in their lives. They've got Goliaths in their lives of poverty or whatever they're facing. And I was like, imagine, with Angel, we collaborated and said, imagine if we could give a route for those kind of kids who'd never, particularly children, who would never get to cinema, just to get into cinema, enjoy watching a movie, have the fun of watching a movie, but then also hopefully be inspired. Like, I can take on my giants. And so, I think it came from my childhood and remembering my first movie and then realizing, wow, it'd be so awesome to get particularly underprivileged kids in and hopefully they inspired by it. Yeah.
I absolutely love that. That's so inspiring. So even not only the movie itself, but the way you allowed people to attend the movie even adds to the inspiration. Phil, this was such a treat. I'm like totally, what do you call it? I'm fanboying. I love the movie. If anyone who has not seen it, go see the movie now. See it while it's in theaters. See it with your family. See it with your friends. Bring your kids' friends. I wish you blessing in everything that you do. I hope people keep seeing this, and I'm very much looking forward to interviewing you about the Esther movie.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, Justin. It's been a privilege to be with you.